I'm going to talk about trade for a few minutes. I don't have 150 slides like my colleague. And we thought about maybe a sexier title, you know, the wonders of free trade or, you know, something. But I said, no, trade. I want to talk about trade. It's sort of the most fundamental of all human activities. I dare say a day doesn't go by where you don't make an exchange with somebody. And it's something that is so ubiquitous in our lives, so common in our lives, that it happens that we don't even pause to reflect upon it at all. And we ought to, because it is one of the miracles of human existence, is the act of trade. Last night, I went over to the grocery store, the Fiesta grocery store. I needed to pick up some Mexican Coke. You'll find out why a little bit later. And as I was leaving, I laid the Coke on the conveyor and I paid the money. What did I say as I was leaving the, probably, what do you think I said as I was leaving? The clerk was standing there, I gave her the money. I said, thank you. Yeah. And she said, gracias, right? And that's an interesting thing. I went and I gave this person some money and they gave me 24 bottles of Mexican Coke and I said, thank you. A little bit of a smile on my face. And she said, thank you. And I realize she's being paid to say thank you, but if you were an external observer, if you were watching, if you were a Martian, just watching from above, this would look like two people having a fairly pleasurable experience. I don't know about you, but if I have an unpleasurable experience, I don't usually thank the person for that, right? In fact, there is this notion that trade is exploitative. There are people who think that trading with other people can be an exploitative relationship. And it may be in some contexts, and we could perhaps debate that. But the normal kind of exchange that you and I do almost every day doesn't appear to be exploitative. Because again, if it was exploitative, I probably wouldn't say thank you. And in fact, it's odd that if it was really so exploitative, I probably wouldn't go, you know, I'm going to come back tomorrow and I'm going to do this again, right? It would be very strange if this was a horrible experience, if this was a painful experience, if this was a harmful experience, it would be doubtful that I would come back and do it again. And I certainly wouldn't thank them. So this gets us to the fundamental point that Adam Smith noted in The Wealth of Nations, that trade is an act that is about mutual benefit. Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want. The essence of trade is me giving you what you want, me giving Fiesta $24, they're $1 per bottle, me giving them $24, and them giving me 24 Cokes. I give them what they want my money, I want their Cokes. It's a trade, and trade makes both parties better off, at least under normal circumstances. Most of the time, there may be exceptions and so on and so forth, but most of the time trade is a mutually beneficial thing, and that's something that Adam Smith mentioned. Adam Smith actually argued that to trade is a uniquely human action. He said no dog exchanges bones with another. He's actually not, we have the hindsight now of a couple hundred years of biology. We know actually there are examples of trade in the animal kingdom besides human beings. Primates do certain types of trade. Observers of all kinds of different species observe trading across the animals. But I can tell you this, no animal except human beings have come up with a 30-year mortgage, right? We have elevated trading to an art form that no other species on Earth can claim. So it's uniquely human, not almost uniquely human. We'll add the word almost, okay? At least the degree to which we trade is something that distinguishes us from animals. I'm going to make two claims today. The first claim is that trade makes us happier. I've already started trying to make that claim a little bit. The second claim is that trade makes us richer. It's actually the harder claim, but I like to start with the easier claim. And to do that, I'm going to show a little clip from a favorite movie of mine, which I hope works. There we go. With any luck, this will work.
Give me a ballpark figure. How much?
6 full nights, days to 4,000.
6 nights at 300 is 1,800.
You want days too?
2,000.
3,000.
Done.
Right. So I'm sure you've all seen the movie Pretty Woman. That actually has nothing to do with that economics. I just like Julia Roberts a lot. Actually, it has a lot to do with economics. You've all seen the movie. You know, of course, we don't need to get into the details of the trade that we just observed. But one of the really things that's cool about this is that there were some numbers. And you know, economists, we like our numbers, right? And you saw the trade. She initially offered her services for $4,000. He countered with $2,000, and they settled in the middle at $3,000. And her reaction, which I don't know what the policies are at your school, you may not be able to use that clip, but her reaction, of course, is one of, it's not just a casual thank you like I was doing yesterday at the grocery store. It was an actual, wow, this is great, thank you. So she's clearly very happy about that. And Richard Gere's character, I think his name was Eddie in the movie, well, I can just tell you, if I made that trade with Julia Roberts, I'd be a happy man. So there, again, this mutually beneficial thing was very evident there. But as I mentioned, one of the cool things is they actually used numbers. She offered $4,000, he countered it too, they settled on $3,000. That $3,000 appeared to be a price that they were both quite pleased at arriving at. Does anybody remember the next scene? There was a little bit of scene where he talks to, I don't know, George Costanza, whoever that guy was. But then right after that, he's leaving for the day, and he's about to walk out of the hotel room. He's going to leave her behind with some money. Do you remember the conversation right at the end, the next scene? Daniel, you know. What'd she say? Yeah, as he's leaving the door, as he's leaving the hotel room, she says, you know, I would have done it for $2. And he says, I would have paid $4. I get chills, actually, thinking about that, because I think that is the coolest aha moment in economics. He would have been willing to pay $4,000. Now we know, what did he have to pay? $3,000. If you walk into a store and pay $3,000 for something that you would have been willing to pay $4,000 for, that's like you found $1,000 sitting on the sidewalk for free. It's like a magic free $3,000 or $1,000. Economists call this consumer surplus. Okay, that's the fancy name for it. Okay, but it's like you found free money lying on the ground. If, in contrast, she was willing to sell for $2,000. She said she was willing to sell for $2,000. She was willing to give up her whole week's worth of services for $2,000. But she got $3,000. She got at least $1,000 more than she was willing to accept. It's again like she found $1,000 sitting on the sidewalk. Value was created right there. And we can measure that value in this particular instance because we actually have the numbers. We don't always get the value of that numbers. We don't always get to measure it so clearly. I probably was willing to pay more than $1 for those Cokes last night. I probably would have paid $2. All right. So frequently, value gets created. When you buy something from someone and you would have been willing to pay more for it than you have to pay, value got created there in your little head. It's very subjective. It's hard to measure sometimes, although here we actually got a glimmer of measurement, which is why it's such a great clip. So, unlike physics, I'm a little bit of a physics nerd too. If I had been a little bit smarter, I'd be doing a physics class right now, not an economics class. This is what happens to someone who isn't smart enough to get a PhD in physics. You become an economist. In physics, you know, we have these laws of conservation. Energy and matter are conserved, neither created nor destroyed. We don't have that constraint in economics. Value, which is the thing we care about. Physicists care about energy and matter. We care about value and value creation. Value is not subject to the law of conservation. We can create it. Like before they made that trade, that happiness, that value did not exist. Then the trade happened and that value, which previously didn't exist, now does exist. It came out of nowhere. Now it exists. Of course, it goes both ways. As you know, this is an illegal transaction. If a vice cop, if a Los Angeles vice detective busts into the room and says, no, 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 you can't do this, what would have happened to the value? It would have disappeared. Where would it have gone? It would have gone into the ether. It would have disappeared, right? So one of the things that I like to emphasize about trading and economics is about value creation, about how you and me, you and I, how we create value in our lives. One of the most fundamental ways in which we do that is by trading with each other. And if we're prevented from trading with each other, which is what a vice cop would be doing in this particular instance, that value that otherwise would have been created might not be created. Okay? That's the kind of thing. So I actually think trade makes us happier. It's a fundamental way in which we, every day, make ourselves happier. That lesson is pretty straightforward. In the curriculum stuff we've provided, there's the trade game. Has anybody played the trade game? The trade game is really not all that exciting. I mean, you've done it. It's a wonderful thing. I've done it for years. I used to have a friend who was a 6th grade teacher, one of my best friends from my baseball team. And I would go into a 6th grade classroom every year, and we would do the trade game. And actually, he's the co-author on the little paper we put in the program there. The trade game illustrates it very nicely. What you do is you go to, if you're not familiar, I'll just describe it quickly. It's in the packet. You get a bunch of trinkets. You go to the dollar store, and it does cost a little bit of money. So you got to go buy, a deck of cards, maybe some lip gloss, some, the little bag of Army Men or whatever you can get really cheap at the dollar store. You get basically one item per student. I try to find weird items and also gendered items. So, lip gloss is kind of a female item, and Army Men are kind of a guy item. So, and then what you do is you distribute these randomly to your students, and you ask them to rate how much it's completely subjective, but they ask them to rate it on a 0 to 10 scale. How much do you like the thing you just got? Put down so if you're the quarterback on the junior high football team and you get the lip gloss, you're probably going to put down like a 2. I mean, I'm just being I know I'm being totally stereotypical here, but and then people put down their numbers, and then what we do is we give them an opportunity to trade. You can do this very simply or very elaborately. There's different ways of doing it, but then you say, how about you trade? And then, of course, in your classroom, chaos erupts, which is fun with 6th graders. When I used to do this with 6th graders, I don't know what it's like with more advanced students, but chaos erupts, all the trading happens. People, hey, I'll give you this lip gloss, which I don't really want, if you give me that deck of cards, which I really would like to have. And then you ask them to rate what they have now. And, that 2 suddenly becomes a 4. I've never had it fail. Every time. And again, we're trying to put numbers, trying to put some concreteness on this notion that trade creates value. That if you have what give me that what you want, I will give you this what you want, as Smith said. So the trade game is a fun, really elementary exercise you can do in a classroom. I've done it myself. I've done it with MBA students, for that matter. It's doable at every level, and it always works. It always illustrates this fundamental principle that trade is a way for us to elevate our level of well-being or satisfaction as measured by ourselves in our own sort of evaluations. It's a fun exercise. Before I get into the really, I think, deep lesson about trade making us richer, I want to pause and reflect about Adam Smith's Invisible Hand. This is a comic strip. I collect comic strips that do economics, and I was surprised that Frank and Ernest, a long-running strip, actually quotes the Invisible Hand here. This is Adam Smith's. Where he says, every individual intends only his own gain and is led by an invisible hand to promote an end, which was no part of his intention. This is the kind of odd thing about the paradox of trade, not the paradox of progress, but sort of the paradox here is that when I bought those 24 Coca-Colas from this nameless clerk at the Fiesta grocery store yesterday, whose name I don't recall, and she doesn't know me. We have no particular affection for each other. I was not buying those Cokes out of any sense of love for that clerk or for the Fiesta Corporation, whoever they are. I was buying those Cokes out of self-love, as Adam Smith said. I was buying those Cokes because I wanted the 24 Cokes. I was thinking about me, Bob Lawson. I was being selfish, if you want to use a somewhat loaded term. And what about the Fiesta Corporation and that clerk? Did they get into business because they loved Bob Lawson and wanted to provide him with some delicious Mexican Coca-Cola? No. But they knew that they wanted my $24. And they're thinking, how do I get Bob Lawson to come to my store and give me $24? I know. I've got to do something that Bob Lawson wants. Bob Lawson wants Mexican Coke. So I'll stock my store with Mexican Coke. Bob Lawson will come in, then he'll give me the $24 that I want. If you are self-loving, sometimes even if you are selfish, again, to use a morally loaded term, in a marketplace where trading is the dominant way in which we engage with each other, it actually ironically requires you to care about the other guy. Fiesta has to care about me and what I want, because that's the only way I'm going to give them the $24. Even if they're only caring about themselves, they have to care about me. which is bizarre. And this is the invisible hand principle, the idea that people who care about themselves, when they engage with trade with others, have to care about other people. So is this, I don't know, is this something we should celebrate? I don't know. Maybe it would be nice if we lived in a world where people would just nicely, voluntarily give me my Mexican Coke. But so far as I know, we don't live in that world. So how do I get my Mexican Coke? Well, I got to appeal to their interests as well. Their interest is my $24. So I'm going to appeal to their love of themselves. They're going to appeal to my love of myself, and magic happens. And we say thank you at the end of the day. All right. I think that's easy. Most people get that. You play the trade game and you do the bar charts where you average out the ratings of everybody when they first started, and after you see that the numbers get higher. From your point of view, the numbers get higher. It works. Convincing people with a little bit of rhetoric and a little bit of like this, that trade is most of the time beneficial for both parties, is a relatively easy concept. I should mention it's not always works that way. Like a thief, a common criminal, a mugger, that doesn't make both parties better off, right? A mugger who comes to you and says your money or your life, in which case I hope you give them the money, right? In this case, it's Texas when you just shoot them. But anyway, but when a mugger says your money or your life, do you say thank you at the end of that transaction? No, you don't. You go, that son of a guy, I'm really mad, right? Okay? So there are exchanges that occur. Like a mugger, in a sense, is exchanging with you. He's giving you your life in exchange for your money. That's not a voluntary exchange. And that voluntary exchange, like the one at the Fiesta grocery store, that was a thank you kind of exchange. The mugger is not a thank you. He's better off because he's got my money. I'm worse off. So there are, I even hesitate to call them trades, but there are transactions that occur that don't leave both parties better off. Criminals, common criminals, certainly don't make the victim better off. But I would argue Fiesta yesterday made me better off when they sold me those Cokes. Anyway, that's the first claim. The second claim is that trade makes us richer. It allows us to take advantage of the process of specialization. And this is a much harder argument. It was actually developed a little bit by Adam Smith, but it was developed in large part by David Ricardo. It was really the finishing touches were put on by David Ricardo. David Ricardo was a very wealthy Londoner who started writing about economics in the early 19th century. 19th century. His law of comparative advantage, which I imagine is familiar to you, there are various ways of saying it. I've got a relatively formal way of saying it. I like the comic strip, though. I think this is High and Lois, but I can't remember the kid's name. Anyway, but he says, I read to his little girlfriend or whatever in the school locker there, I read your email, it was kind of romantic. She says, I know my friend is really good at writing this. So her friend is better at writing romantic emails than the dark-haired lady, girl. She's not good at writing a romantic email, so she's let her friend do that for her. She's traded, really, with her friend. Presumably there was some transaction where her friend was doing this. It's kind of a Cyrano de Bergerac kind of story there, too. So this idea of specialization, that someone else maybe should do something for you. Well, because they're better at it. In the language of economics, it's that they do it at lower cost. All right. So the theory of comparative advantage here is that people, and it could be any group of people. It could be two people. It could be a large group of people. It could be two nations. The size of this idea scales to the whole nations, to the whole world. The idea is that if people specialize in producing what they do at low cost, which is the economist's way of saying specializing in doing what you do well, that output will increase, productivity will increase. Okay? This is actually a very subtle and difficult concept. Just saying it like that has convinced exactly 0 of my students. The best way I have is of conveying the beauty of comparative advantage is with a simple numerical example. Here's one. You can invent many, 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 many examples. This is done with an international trade context with the United States and Japan. Again, you could use two people's names. You could use Timmy and Sally or something. It really wouldn't matter. the size of whether it's a country or two groups of people or it doesn't really, two individuals, it doesn't matter. Looking over here on the sort of left side, these numbers are reflecting output per workers per day. So what we see here is that in the United States, these are made up numbers, but just to illustrate the principle. So in the United States, it says 2, which means that a worker in the United States could produce 2 units of food a day, 2 bushels of wheat a day. Whereas in Japan, a Japanese worker can make 3 bushels of wheat in a day. In the case of clothing, the United States worker can make 1 unit of clothing a day, and the Japanese worker can make 9 units of clothing a day. The first observation I would have is that, wow, we suck. No, I mean, the way the example is constructed, it looks like the Japanese workers are uniformly more productive than the American workers. That Japanese food workers can outproduce American food workers, and Japanese clothing workers can outproduce American clothing workers. You would think this is going to be a bad situation for us in the United States. And indeed, it is always better to be more productive, so it is probably good. But the interesting thing is, is that there's an opportunity here embedded in the program, in these numbers that is worth investigating. Let's suppose, as a thought experiment, we take 3 American workers and we move them out of the clothing industry into the food industry. One of the basic lessons of economics is every choice you make has a benefit and a cost. So what's the benefit of moving 3 of our workers from clothing to food? Well, the answer is we get more food. How much more food? If we move 3 of our workers, if we move 3 American workers out of clothing and into food, each of those workers would now produce 2 units of food a day. 2 times 3 is 6, so we would end up with 6 more units of food produced in the United States. But at what cost? Every worker that's now working in the food industry, those 3 workers now working in the food industry are not working in the clothing industry. We would lose 1 unit of clothing per day per worker. We would use 3 units of food. So we would get 6 units of food and lose 3 units of clothing. Okay. Let's suppose that in Japan we do sort of the opposite. In Japan, let's just move 1 worker. We move 1 worker from the food industry to the clothing industry. If we move 1 Japanese worker out of the food industry, we would lose 3 units of food, and we would gain 9 units of clothing. Of course, what's the magic here? What's happened to the total amount of food and clothing? It's gone up. The world now has 3 more units of food than it had a minute ago, and 6 more units of clothing than it had a minute ago. The world is richer. Now, the interesting thing is, there's a saying in economics, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You may have heard that. Tannstafel, which was made famous by Robert Heinlein in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, actually. Tannstafel, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. It's one of my favorite phrases. It has a lot of applications in economics. But this looks like almost a free lunch. All we've done is reorganize our labor force. In the United States, we moved a few workers from clothing to food, and in Japan, we moved a worker from food to clothing. Are we working any harder? No. Do we have any more people working? Nope. Do we have new technology? Nope. Nothing has changed. All we've done in this example is specialize. The mere act of specialization unleashed 3 more units of food and 6 more units of clothing without working any harder. This sounds like a pretty close to a free lunch, and it is. It is one of the most powerful ways in which we increase our productivity, is searching out and looking for ways to specialize in this manner. Now, you could keep doing this logic. Well, that was fun. Let's do it again. Right? Let's move another 3 workers in America out of clothing and into food. Let's move more workers in Japan out of food and into clothing. Now, in the limit, you see what happens. If you sort of continue this logic, what happens? All of the workers, if you take a specialized international trade class, I would explain why this never happens to completeness. But for the sake of this argument, in the limit, what would happen, of course, is that all the workers in Japan would be making clothing, and all the workers in America would be making food. Imagine this is kind of not obviously a sensible world we're living in now. We'd have a lot of well-dressed, starving people in Japan, and a lot of fat, naked people in America, right? So all the food would be grown in America, and all the clothing would be in Japan. Obviously, we need to trade, right? We've now exploited this specialization. We've got all the food, all this really food that's been produced in the United States, and we've got all this clothing that's been produced in Japan. We need to actually ship some of our food to Japan. They need to ship some of their clothing to us. In real life, it isn't done by barter, but it almost is done actually by barter. Okay, so we need to trade. This is why trade and specialization are so inexorably linked. If the United States and Japan, in this example, could not trade, then we wouldn't be able to specialize so much, right? Because it would be very hard for us to grow all the food but no clothing. We got to have clothes, right? It's cold out there, right? So we would not be able to fully specialize unless we knew we would be able to take the thing that we specialized in and trade it with them. And likewise, they would not fully specialize unless they knew they could trade it with us. The fact that you can trade after you've done the specialization, the fact that you can trade is important. If you didn't think you could trade with other people, you would not be able to specialize. Frequently I hear politicians, let me go back to that. Frequently I hear politicians talk about self-sufficiency or energy independence. That's my favorite. Do you ever see this movie? I don't have a clip. It's a gruesome clip, actually. So that's one of the reasons I don't have it. Castaway with Tom Hanks. Now, I love finding economic moments in movies. One of the reasons I like Pretty Woman so much is because that is just such a magical economics moment when they're in that bathroom. This movie I hate. The economics is terrible. You know the movie, he lands on a deserted island all by himself. He was there 4 years. Yeah, but you know what happens in real life to someone who lands on a deserted island? They die. Gruesomely. And it's not something I would want to watch a movie about. The real problem for Tom Hanks is he's all alone. He can't trade with anyone. So he has to do everything himself. He is self-sufficient. He's got to make his own shelter, make his own fire. Like an hour, it's like an excruciating hour of that movie was him trying to make fire, right? He has to be his own dentist. That's his dental tool right there, right? That toothache would have killed a real human being. He would have died from that, in all likelihood. He probably would have died before this ever happened in the movie. He would have cut himself on the coral, gotten an infection, and died horribly 5 days later. That's what really happens to human beings who are self-sufficient, right? We know this. And yet, politicians, God bless them, I love politicians because they keep me in business. I mean, I would have nothing to talk about if it weren't for them. They try to sell us, you know, we should be self-sufficient. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith has this wonderful passage, I think it's a wonderful passage, that says, you know, by means of glasses, hotbeds, and hot walls, which I don't know what any of those things are. I think he means greenhouses, basically. By means of greenhouses, shall we say, very good grapes can be raised in Scotland, and a very good wine, too, can be made of them at about 30 times the expense of wine that we can be brought from foreign countries. He asks rhetorically, would it be a reasonable law to prohibit the importation of all foreign wines, merely to encourage the making of Claret and Burgundy in Scotland? It is possible to grow wine and grow grapes and wine in Scotland. It's possible to make salmon in Florida and grow oranges in Alaska. It's possible. It's just stupid and really, really expensive. It takes a lot of resources to make wine in Scotland. Resources are scarce. Every one of those resources that could have been used to make, that is now making grapes in Scotland, could have been doing something that Scotland is better equipped to do, like, I don't know, grow sheep. Okay? You're good at making sheep, grow sheep. Trade the sheep to the French, who make good wine. This was a hard argument to make. I'll talk about this a little bit in my second talk. It's a very difficult argument to make. It's still a difficult argument to make. The idea that you should trade with other people, especially when those people don't look like you, speak different languages, maybe worship different religions. In the case of England and France, literally had been fighting wars on and off again with each other for hundreds of years. But Smith argued, and I'm arguing, that if you trade with other people, you unleash this process of specialization. And if you don't trade with other people, you forego, you don't do that specialization, and you're poorer. Yeah, you're more self-sufficient, but you're poorer as a result. That's the grand message of comparative advantage. And if you like being your own dentist, I guess, there you go. Now, Adam Smith said all this in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations. David Ricardo wrote. John Stuart Mill wrote. Even John Maynard Keynes, the macroeconomist, he was a free trader. Among the economists, economics community, this notion that trade is pretty beneficial to humankind, both in the sense that it's a way to create consumer surplus, makes us happier, and in the sense that it unleashes benefits through comparative advantage specialization. This is, dare I say, it's dogma in economics. It's clearly not dogma with politicians. There are a lot of arguments that politicians raise and other people raise, and I should address the yeah buts. This is some of the yeah buts. There may be more yeah buts out there than the three I have here, but the three most common yeah buts I see are these three. First, well, Lawson, if we rely on other countries, this is more of an international trade context, but if we rely on other countries for our materials our living materials, our things, what if we have a war? What if we have a war with one of those countries? Then they'll have us. They'll whatever. You'll hear this with the steel industry. One of the arguments that have been used by different politicians about steel protectionism, tariffs and quotas for steel, is that, well, if we have a war, we need to have a domestic steel industry that we can rely upon to build the tanks and the airplanes and such that we need. Interesting argument. It's not totally implausible on its face. However, in the hands of special interests and politicians, it's easily abused. A certain person running for president from the state of Florida, I guess there's two of them, so I'm not totally identifying this person. Oh, let's say the senator from Florida, I am now, recently was defending the United States sugar quota program. We have a massive sugar quota. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. And he says, we need to protect American sugar farmers. There's about 20,000 of them in the United States, the whole country. It's a tiny drop in the bucket. But a lot of them are in Florida. Some are in Louisiana. Some are in Hawaii. A lot of them are in Florida. And we need to protect these critically important sugar growers because we need to have a domestic sugar industry in case there's a war. How are we going to feed our troops without sugar? This is, I'm trying to think, this is ridiculous, right? This is an absolutely insane argument, right? For so many reasons. First of all, how many other countries in the world sell sugar besides the United States? Dozens and dozens. Brazil, all of Latin and South America. Go to Africa, West Africa, they grow sugar. Sugar is grown throughout Asia. If we are having a war with all of those countries simultaneously, we have bigger problems to worry about than lack of a domestic sugar industry. Right? Also, the biggest sugar grower in our hemisphere is Cuba, probably. And we've already got plans designed to take them. It's on the books. We're ready to pull the trigger any moment, right? We've been dying to do it for 50 years anyway. Look, in the event of a war and we want sugar, what do? We just take it. If we can't, again, if in the event of a war, if we can't take Cuba, we've got bigger problems. This is an argument that is used by industry after industry after industry, and it is, on its face, ridiculous. And yet a prominent senator from the state of Florida who's running for president, has a reasonably good chance of becoming president, actually in public advances this argument. So it's not completely ridiculous to argue that there may be some industries that are hypercritical. But what you see in the real life is this argument is grotesquely abused. And we ought to be aware of that. The next one is dumping. I never really understood the argument against dumping. Dumping is the practice, nominally speaking, it's the practice of selling something below cost in order to drive out your competitors. Frequently in the international context, This is about foreign governments subsidizing their producers, which makes those producers more competitive and therefore harms our producers. All of this is potentially true. I'm not going to dispute the facts of this matter. I think there is ample evidence, for example, that China does subsidize some of their companies, and those companies are therefore able to sell their product more affordably abroad, and it makes companies in the United States who are not so similarly subsidized at a competitive disadvantage. All of that may be true, but I'm actually having some trouble. Why should I care? And with not being facetious here, why should I care? If the Chinese taxpayers and Chinese government want to subsidize Chinese firms and workers to work for me, to provide me stuff cheaper than we can do it, I am actually in favor of this. I'm like, yes, more please. I know the argument is that they'll drive us out of business and then they'll jack up the prices. There's been never any history, no evidence of this actually ever happening on planet Earth, but I'm actually kind of in favor of dumping. I think we should not, I mean, like really, you guys want to sell us stuff below cost? This is something we would object to. When I was at the store yesterday and I paid $1 for those 24 Cokes, if they'd said, oh, well, you know, we're actually selling them for 50 cents now, it's a sale. Would I have gone, no, I don't want that. No, I want to pay $1. That's insane. No one does this. This is crazy. No rational person would do this. No rational country would say, no, we don't want your cheap stuff. You keep that cheap stuff. We'd like more expensive stuff. That doesn't make sense. All right. So the dumping argument, I think, on its face has trouble. The last argument, the first character in my mind associated with the infant industry argument is Alexander Hamilton. This goes back to the American founding. Alexander Hamilton argued that American manufacturing industry, which in the founding era, of course, manufacturing in the United States was very primitive. Europe, England especially, had already begun its industrial revolution. We had really not. We were primarily farming and other types of extractive industries in the United States. But there was a sort of nascent manufacturing industry developing in the United States, and Hamilton, the friend of New York manufacturing, he wanted to protect them so that they have he says, you know, the problem is that they're like babies. They're like babies. They're new. And what do we do with babies? We protect them, right? We protect the babies. We let them grow up. And then after they get 18, we say, go, right? No, they grow up, and at some point we let them go out into the world and fend for themselves, right? These industries are infants. They need to be protected like infants, literally like infants. Okay, maybe this is plausible, maybe it's not. I could argue on some theoretical grounds against it. But let's ask ourselves, in the real world you and I live in, what are the new industries in America? The infant industries. Biotech, genetic, CRISPR slicing DNA, some, software, so on. Those are the new industries in America. Do they get a lot of protectionism? Nope. Who gets protectionism in America? Steel, agriculture, textiles, petroleum. This is actually, so the infant industry argument is an argument you'll see in the books. You'll see, what actually happens in the real world is senile industries. Dead, dying industries. I call it the senile industry argument. The senile industries are the ones that actually get protection. So if you are in favor of the argument that we should protect infant industries, you need to be against, you ought to be against, I think, steel quotas, steel tariffs. Because that's not a new industry. We've had steel since the 1840s. I mean, when are they going to grow up, right? They need to grow up already, okay? So all of these arguments are used I think in each case, when you think about it carefully, they are either invalid on their face or they're grossly abused in practice. The real argument, of course, for why we have restrictions on trade is because we have a political system that responds reasonably well to special interests. How many sugar farmers? 20,000 sugar farms. Maybe 3 people per farm. We're talking about 60,000 with their workers, maybe 100,000, 200,000 workers. I mean, this is a country of 150 million labor force or something. Okay, so So the sugar industry is, from an employment point of view, vanishingly small. The sugar quota program in the United States, it varies from year to year depending on production and prices, but on average, doubles the price of sugar in the United States. You can buy a wholesale level amount of sugar. It's usually twice as expensive here as it is on the world market because we keep sugar out of the United States. It limits the supply in the United States, drives up the price. It's generally speaking about 2 times more expensive. Now, how many people in the United States consume sugar? I think that is roughly speaking the number of people in the United States. Everybody, in one way or another. Every candy bar, every Coca-Cola, every cupcake, everything you've had that has sugar in it is more expensive because of the United States Sugar Quota Program. It is harming literally everybody in America. But how much? If you take the amount of sugar that you bought this year, including all the sugar that you bought that was embedded in the various products that you purchased, and double the sugar price. $100, $200, $500, whatever, I don't know. If you've got a sweet tooth, $500. I don't have a sweet tooth, $100. Is there sugar in beer? Not this kind of sugar. Alcohol is a different kind of sugar. All right. So for me, $100. Okay. Now, $100 is real money, right? $500 is real money. But it's not like a crazy amount of money. Would you get on an airplane, fly to Washington, D.C., to meet with your congressman, to lobby against the sugar quota program, because, it's costing you $500? Well, the plane ride is going to cost you $500, right? It was irrational for you as an individual person in this country. It is irrational for you to complain about the sugar quota program. It's costing you $100, $200, $300, $500 a year. It's costing you money, you and your family money. But it would be irrational to complain about it because the cost of complaining about it would actually be more than the thing itself. Okay? But what if you're one of those 20,000 sugar farm owners? It's doubling the price of the sugar you sell. It's literally doubling your income. If you're a $1 million sugar farmer, you make $1 million a year, now it's going to be $2 million. For an extra $1 million, would you get on a plane and fly to Washington? Yes, no problem. Washington, D.C. has people walking around the Capitol Hill right now as we speak, whose job it is to talk to these legislators, these senators and congressmen, to convince them that the sugar program is a great idea. National defense, Not a single human being calls their congressman or senator, hardly, maybe a couple weird economists, calls their congressman to complain about it. Now, you're a congressman. You're a good guy. Used to sell cars back in the home district, so I don't want to run for Congress. Just want to help my people. Don't really have a lot of sugar farmers in Texas, but there may be a couple actually down in East Texas, I don't know. But every day I'm getting these visits from these people, and they're telling me what a great program this is. Oh, they donated some money to my campaign. That was nice too. And no one's complaining about it. I get people out there taking phone calls from constituents. Not a single one of my constituents has called to complain about the sugar program. So what do? Come on, you're a rational congressman. You vote for it, sure. Yeah. Right. So this program unambiguously harms vastly more people than it helps. The total amount of harm is vastly greater than the total amount of gain by any measure. I can show fancy supply and demand graphs to demonstrate that, but that's not really important here. But why would such a policy pass? Well, it's because of the way the political process works. The special interest, which concentrates benefits on a small number of people, giving them strong incentives to advocate for their position, but disperses the costs across hundreds of millions of people. So it's only $100 a person, giving them no real incentive to complain. That's how these things get passed. Now I have this, hence the Mexican Coke example. One of the beautiful things about economics is understanding is seeing how the law of unintended consequences plays out. So we have a sugar quota program in the United States, which drastically reduces the amount of sugar, drives up the price of sugar in the United States. Companies like Brock's, the candy company in Chicago, they get hammered. Because there really isn't much of a substitute when you're making little peppermints and things. There isn't much of a substitute for refined cane sugar. But if you're making Coca-Cola in the United States, what's the substitute? Corn syrup. Right? So American Coca-Cola is not made with refined cane sugar. It's made with corn syrup. So one of the interesting things is there's also another dynamic here. We keep sugar out of the country. It dries up the price of sugar, which makes the sugar farmers very happy. And people start switching over to corn syrup, which makes the corn farmers happy. So now you got a dual alliance. The corn lobby and the sugar lobby now realize, wait, if you guys keep sugar out, that makes you guys happy with the sugar prices going up, but it also gives us more business and dries up the price of corn. And that's why American Coke tastes like crap. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Actually, it doesn't taste like crap. But in your packet, sorry, I'm going to try to stave off a cold fish. In your packet, there's an article written by a friend of mine. He's a Texas Tech professor now. He wasn't at Texas Tech when he wrote it, but he calls it, it's classroom exercise you can do, and I've done this too. It's very, very fun. It's called tasting protectionism. And what you do is you bring in some Mexican Coke, which is now quite easy to get, even all over the country. You can get it in, I'm from Ohio, you can get it in Ohio now. Of course, in Texas, it's quite easy to get. Get some Mexican Coke, get some American Coke, and you do a taste test. And you can do it however you want to do it. You can do it blind or not blind. There's various ways of doing taste tests. If you've ever done like wine tasting, you can different scenarios. And the article that's in your packet describes that. But it's actually fun because it tastes different. You don't always note it, but if you do it side by side, and we're going to have Mexican and American Coke at lunch today, by the way. So you can, and Dixie cups, so you can taste both. You can do your own. And I've done this with my students, and after doing this talk about sugar quotas and blah, 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 and special interest, we said, hey, look, we're gonna, this is real. This is actually not just some economist chalkboard economics. This is actually affecting your life, and you can taste it. So we do the taste test. Everybody can taste the difference. One of the interesting things is if you do this with a very American audience, invariably they like the American Coke more than the Mexican Coke because that's what they're used to. But the fact that they can taste the difference is the critical lesson. I love this actually because like a lot of the things, what your students remember and what you want them to remember are sometimes very different things. So I've had students 5 years later, hey, I remember tasting, I can taste Mexican Coke is different. They couldn't tell me anything else about the class I taught probably, but they remember that. So, you know, these hands-on kind of applied things, as you probably know from your own experience, are very, very effective mechanisms for burning in a lesson. It may not always burn in exactly the lesson you hoped it would burn in, but at least they'll remember something from your class 5 or 6 years later. Okay. All right. Now, I'm going to edge towards concluding. We'll have some time for Q&A, conversation, whatever, before lunch. What time is the? 20 minutes. Okay, we're great. You know, the biggest yeah but isn't really one of the formal yeah buts, but the biggest yeah but is what about the jobs? If you have free trade, what about the jobs? And it's a real argument. The fact of the matter is, what happened in the example a few minutes ago to American clothing workers? There were fewer jobs for American clothing workers. There were more jobs for American food workers. What happened in Japan? There were more jobs for Japanese clothing workers, but fewer jobs for. So there are going to be changes. International trade and taking advantage of specialization unambiguously costs jobs. It also gains jobs. Right? Economics, I think one of the things that really draws me to it, one of the things I really like about economics is it forces us to do a complete calculus of everybody. It's about all the winners and all the losers, and do a true accounting. Yes, there are losers. If you are in an industry that is competing against an imported products, your jobs are under competitive pressure. We should not hide from that. We should not say it doesn't exist. It absolutely does exist. I've got family members. I'm from Ohio. I know, I really know the harm that international trade can impose on certain communities. Okay. I also know what happens if you stop the world and don't let those jobs go away. If you stop the world and you don't let those jobs in Youngstown go away. I'm from Southern Ohio, so I don't like Youngstown anyway. But anyway, you let those jobs stay. What does that mean? We don't have the software engineers that are writing that code. And we don't have the DNA engineers who are slicing DNA that are going to save people's lives or make those new mosquitoes that are going to get rid of this virus thing, right? These GMO mosquitoes, I want them now. I want them released. So if you protect jobs in one area, what that means is you can't grow jobs in another area. There's only so many people at any point in time. There's only so many human beings to work with. Protecting jobs here means destroying jobs there. Destroying jobs here means we can have more jobs here. There's no way around that fundamental reality. But if you protect jobs in areas where we don't have comparative advantage, what are you doing? You're causing productivity to fall, output to fall. We're poorer. It can be done, but it makes us poorer, not richer. I would like politicians to be honest. I would love a politician to come to me, a Youngstown politician, an old Rust Belt politician. I would love it if they would just be honest and say, you know what? I'm going to propose a policy that's going to help these people over here, keep their jobs, keep those steel mills open, keep that cheap Brazilian steel out, that Indonesian steel, that's no good. We keep those jobs in Bethlehem and Youngstown. Oh, by the way, it's going to make America poorer. I would just love that level of honesty, because that's what it will do. It makes us poorer. And if you think it's, I'm sure the Bethlehem and Youngstown people think it's a worthwhile deal, but if we would just have a more honest discussion about this, I'd be much, much, much happier. Instead, what do politicians say? I'm going to protect these jobs, and it's going to make us richer. That's not true. It's literally false. Protecting those jobs makes us poorer, not richer. So the whole jobs debate, I think, is meritorious, but I would like to see more honesty. And I think it's worthwhile asking the question why 330 million Americans should have to suffer to $100, $200, $300, $400, $500 a person so we can protect 20,000 sugar farmers or even 100,000 Youngstowners. If I'm being flippant, what have they done for me? And why should we be poorer to protect some people? Maybe we could do some things to help them make the adjustment process better. I'm all in favor of doing that. But actually understanding the economics is my main issue. Okay, just to conclude, and maybe we have some questions. Again, the duality here, the two things that I think are important. Number one, trade makes us happier. This is the thank you lesson. I think to me that's enough. Even if the second part about comparative advantage was not on the table, I would still think trade is good because I like having exchanges with other people where I walk away from the thing better off, happier than I started. I think that's a good thing. We should do more of those things. And more trading means more thank you moments. But in addition to making us happier, it makes us richer. And from a standard of living point of view, the food, clothing, shelter, the material standard of life, the MRI machines, all the things in life that we need to stay alive. To the extent we use this specialization and direct resources to where they have comparative advantages, we're going to have more stuff. More stuff is better, makes our lives better off. And also, again, we don't have to work any harder to get it. It's like a free lunch.